Quisiera decirles que realmente es para nosotros un lujo y un privilegio tener con nosotros a una intelectual de la categoría del profesor Dunbar. Para Mente y Lenguaje y para Estudios Generales Letras es realmente esencial tener este tipo de actividades de naturaleza interdisciplinaria, porque durante mucho tiempo la vida académica se ha acostumbrado a creer que los problemas, las preguntas intelectuales pertenecen a una u otra disciplina. Y con frecuencia eso ha generado también problemas políticos y territoriales. Es decir, los antropólogos se sentían dueños de ciertos problemas, o los filósofos, o los psicólogos, y lo que estamos viendo en el mundo contemporáneo es que los problemas no tienen ciudadanía. Es decir, que hay problemas que pertenecen al mismo tiempo al ámbito de la psicología, de la antropología, de la filosofía, de la biología, y entonces la manera apropiada de abordarlos es desde este punto de vista interdisciplinario. El profesor Dunbar es autor de una teoría particularmente original y creativa que ha recibido el nombre de la teoría del cerebro social. Sobre eso va a hablar ahora cuando hable sobre la evolución de las redes sociales. Esta teoría intenta explicar una serie de fenómenos, pero particularmente uno que ha concitado el interés de los científicos durante muchísimos años y que no ha tenido una respuesta fácil, que es el crecimiento del cerebro, sobre todo del lóbulo frontal, en nuestra línea homínida durante los últimos 3 millones de años. Como sabemos, hace 3 millones de años nuestros antepasados tenían una masa encefálica de aproximadamente 350 a 400 centímetros cúbicos, mientras que hoy día el cerebro de una persona promedio es de aproximadamente 1.400, 1.450 centímetros cúbicos. Eso requiere de una explicación, porque los otros primates no han sufrido un crecimiento encefálico tan grande. Por otra parte, como sabemos, el cerebro es un órgano sumamente costoso en términos de energía. Tener un cerebro tan grande genera muchos problemas adaptativos, puede resultar incluso contraadaptativo. Es decir, no solo por la cantidad de energía que consume el cerebro, sino porque genera también problemas logísticos. Es decir, el embarazo se hace mucho más difícil, el parto se hace peligroso y difícil, el tiempo de madurez que tienen los niños para volverse autónomos es mucho más largo. De hecho, todos los seres humanos nacemos prematuros porque el cerebro no está suficientemente maduro hasta cuando el niño tiene aproximadamente 1 año de vida, lo cual hace que en sentido literal, no en sentido metafórico, sino en sentido literal, parte de la gestación de los niños se da fuera del vientre materno, es decir, en un entorno social. Pues todo esto, evidentemente, es fuertemente contraadaptativo, ¿no? Y requiere de una explicación. Hasta donde se cree, hasta donde creen algunas personas, nuestro cerebro dejó de crecer hace más o menos 200.000 años, ¿no? En esa época resultaba ya un cerebro sobrecalificado para las necesidades de supervivencia y adaptativas de nuestros ancestros homínidos. Entonces, tenemos varias preguntas sobre la mesa. Primero, ¿por qué el cerebro creció de esta manera tan impresionantemente rápida en los últimos 3 millones de años, mientras que los cerebros de nuestros parientes primates no lo hicieron, ¿no? Segundo, ¿por qué el cerebro resultó sobrecalificado? Es decir, tenía una masa muy superior de la que era necesaria para resolver los problemas del entorno y la presión selectiva de un mundo de hace 200.000 años. La respuesta, o una de las respuestas más interesantes, es la respuesta que ofrece el profesor Robin Dunbar. La idea es que el cerebro crece como consecuencia de la presión por concebir, desarrollar una serie de vínculos sociales que tienen que ver con la capacidad metarepresentacional, con la capacidad de simulación, con la capacidad de tener varios niveles de atribución psicológica. Entonces, sobre todo esto va a hablar el profesor Dunbar en esta ocasión. La mecánica va a ser la siguiente: vamos a tener la exposición del profesor Dunbar hasta más o menos las 4:30, luego tendremos un break, un coffee break, para que puedan tomar un café, y luego continuaremos con preguntas y con observaciones del público.
Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, so what I'm going to do is really pick up on one key issue. I talked a little bit about this in the lecture yesterday, but I avoided talking about it this morning, partly because there's already so much to say about language. But really, it's the issue of the fact that language itself, although it's very valuable in terms of communication of information, has one deep problem, if you like, in terms of social bonding, and that is it doesn't have this endorphin kick that seems to be so important to primates. And I've given the title "The Problem of Social Bonding" to this talk because it's become apparent in the course of our analyses, particularly of brain evolution in primates and primate sociality, that the whole nature of social bonds is a real problem. We don't actually understand what a relationship is. It's something we don't have a good handle on, so we don't know how to deal with it. So in some sense, until we do, we're kind of swimming in the deep sea a little bit here in terms of understanding the nature of sociality and the cognitive biological processes that lie behind that. So this is really, I suppose, some organized thoughts on where we are with struggling with this problem. Okay, so this is just a reminder of the social brain hypothesis. The explanation for why primates have big brains is that they have bigger brains than is true of other groups of animals and birds. And it's because they live in complex social systems. So they need a much bigger computer to do all the calculations necessary to live in these complex societies. So these are just 3 different kinds of data, brain data, to show that you get exactly the same kind of relationship. It's taking group size, average group size for a species as a measure of social complexity, and it's plotting it against different measures of neocortex size, in particular, calculated or determined in various different ways. So these are histological data. They've taken brains from species, they've cut them in very thin slices and measured the size of bits of the brain. And so these are our original data. This is the volume of the neocortex, estimated in this way, divided by the volume of the rest of the brain, the parts of the brain really that are managing the body and survival and life, keeping you alive, differentiating between the bits of the brain that are mainly to do with keeping you alive and the bits of the brain that are, if you like, smart. And you get these nice relationships with prosimians here, the lemurs and galagos, bush babies and so on, the monkeys in the middle here, and the apes with humans up there to the right-hand side, suggesting that as you go from this side to this side, the size of the computer you need to allow you to have a group of a particular size is increasing. So monkeys here need a bigger brain to support a group size of 10 than prosimians do, who only need this much brain. Monkeys need that much brain. And apes, in turn, need even more brain, suggesting as you go from here to here, something is happening in terms of the complexity of the social relationships and therefore the complexity of the cognition that underpins those relationships. These are data, again, histological data, but they're focusing on just prefrontal cortex volume. Here are the apes, very nicely aligned. There's only, in this data set, there's only one data point for macaques. And these are MRI-based neuroimaging data from the Rilling lab at Duke in the USA. Again, the apes here, the monkeys, and the prosimians down here. So, suggesting very much the same thing. these three grades of sociality, as it were. As you're going from left to right, things are becoming more complex. You need a bigger computer to support the same group size. And I just reiterate the point I made in the discussion yesterday, really, that our problem has been getting good enough quality data. These brain data, at the end of the day, are very, very crude. They're just looking at volumes of the brain or bits of the brain. But it's the best we can do, because we just don't have enough data on the neural circuitry that really underpins this. But we believe that even these crude volumetric values give us some degree of the picture, as it were. And what is surprising, really, is that even though that is not very accurate, it's rather crude data, it still produces these data points which lie very tightly on these lines. There isn't a huge amount of error variance in there, all things considered. Actually, it's a matter of interest. It turns out things are a bit more complicated than that. I'm not going to show that, I don't think. But in fact, it turns out that in here, there are not just two grades of this kind, but three. And these species here lie on a separate grade out here. And these are squirrel monkeys from Amazonian squirrel monkeys, who for a long time, they have very big groups, but very small neocortices. And for a long time, their social system has puzzled primatologists because it's very chaotic. Nobody quite understands what they're doing. And I think this is the answer here. They're living in groups, for ecological reasons, they're living in groups that are much bigger than is possible for their brains to handle. And that's why it appears to be so chaotic. Kind of interesting discovery. Okay. The story is even more complicated than this, because when we try to look to see whether this social brain argument, which applies so nicely to primates, applies to other groups of birds and mammals, the answer turned out to be, to our surprise, no. Here are the data for primates. These are data for artiodactyl ungulates. That's the deer, cow, sheep, antelope family. These are data for carnivores. That's the cat and dog families, and the mustelids, I can't think of the right name for them, the other smaller carnivores anyway. And these are data for bats, and then we have about 137 bird species wrapped up in here all together, as it were. But what's very striking about these results is this quantitative relationship between group size and brain size, such as you have here. This nice quantitative relationship is very clear in the primate data. So what each of these bars represent is solitary species here, monogamous species here, harem-forming species where you have one male and several females in the social group, several breeding females, and then large multi-male, multi-female groups. We have many males and many females. These are very typical, this kind of social system is very typical of many Amazonian forest monkeys, howler monkeys, well, to some extent howler monkeys, but capuchin monkeys in particular. This is very typical of many old world baboon macaque species. But in essentially you're going from small species that live in very small social groups to species that live in very big social groups, and you can see this is relative brain size relative to, or neocortex size relative to body size. Brain size is small here, it's negative, going up to large here. This is above the line, so there's a steady increase. It's the same relationship we saw before. But when we did this for these groups of mammals and birds, we found no relationship. When we first started, we tried to do the analysis like this for the other mammals and birds, and we're surprised to find no relationship at all. And then when we did the analysis in this fashion, where we have mating system essentially, then out came these very, very straightforward results. And for all these four groups here, covering almost all the other birds and mammals, the key thing is the species that have big brains are the ones that live in pair-bonded monogamous mating systems. Species that are solitary, species that live in large multi-male, multi-female groups tend to have rather small brains for body size all considered. The birds are slightly different here. We've got solitary species, pair-bonded species, species that live in bonded groups, but with several males and several females together, and then species of birds that live in loose aggregations. And again, it's these bonded species, pair-bonded or multi-bonded species of birds that have these big brains. Primates seem to be the odd one out. They're different to everybody else. And so that kind of raised questions, really, about what the nature of these pair bonds are. It made us ask, well, why is monogamy so expensive computationally? Because actually everybody else had predicted that the species that would have the biggest brains would be these species here, which are mating polygamously. And so they argued that species where males are mating with many different females would need big brains so that they could keep all these separated and these relationships not interfering with each other. But it turns out not to be so. Promiscuous mating systems do not require big brains. What requires a big brain is pair-bonded monogamy. The question then is, why? You know, what's so complicated about pair-bonded monogamy that it requires this massive computer to deal with it? And then in some sense, what's happened here with primates that they differ from these species here? There are some exceptions. Turns out that this is the perissodactyl family, the odd-toed ungulates, as opposed to the even-toed ungulates. So here we have all the horse family, horses, mules, not mules, donkeys, zebras, asses, wild asses, and these are tapirs and rhinoceroses and those sort of species. So they're a different group to the antelope and deer family. And here you can see a very nice quantitative relationship, possibly mainly due to the horses looking like they're really big primates with hooves. There's something about their social systems which are more like primates than like these other ungulates here. But this is one of the cases where we can show that there seems to be some primate-like effects. But you know, this is a very small group of species. There aren't many species in this class. Most mammals come in these three groups here. We know it has to do with the bondedness of the relationship. It's not to do with biparental care, because an alternative argument is that big brains are necessary in order to have biparental care, or simply a correlate of biparental care. That's to say, both sexes feed the offspring, as you have in many of the small birds, where both parents bring food back to the nest. But we can show that that's not the case. These are data for the bird species. And what it is, again, is relative brain size here, plotted for species that have long-term, lifelong pair bonds. So these are species like parrots, crows, albatross, these kind of species. Species that have short-term pair bonds here, annual pair bonders. So these are like the finches and the starlings and many of these kind of birds. And then species that mate polygamously or promiscuously, where you tend to have females like peacocks, for example, where the females go off and lay, or ostriches, females go off and lay their eggs, and the male has no involvement in it. And what's very nice here is that you can see as the pair bondedness becomes more permanent. So these are temporary pair bonds. Each year, the male and female find a new partner. The pair bond only has to work for the year. So they need a bigger brain than promiscuous species, but they don't need a huge brain. The species that need very big brains are the ones that have lifelong pair bonds. Where do humans sit here? Well, we won't go into that one. And the reason primates seem to be so different in these terms, what we think has happened is that primates have taken the cognition required to support pair-bonded monogamy, in effect, and generalized it to create friendships. Right? Now, these friendships are pair bonds, but they're not reproductive pair bonds. They're just close relationships, as we might call them, friendships. And this is quite clear if you look at the frequency with which you get bonded and unbonded social systems in these species. So here we've got ungulates again, the deer family group, deer antelope family group, the carnivores, the dogs and the cats, the prosimian primates here, the galagos and lemurs from Madagascar, and then the monkeys and apes here. And what we've got plotted here is the proportion of species or genera actually, that live in unbonded social systems. So these, although the group may stay together, it has no kind of deep bonded relationships, no special friendships, if you like, compared to the proportion of genera which live in monogamous systems and those that live in bonded social systems where individuals have very tight, close relationships with other members of the group, but non-reproductive ones, friendships. And you can see ungulates predominantly have this unbonded kind, carnivores and even prosimian primates. Again, unbonded kinds are more common. The difference is made up with more monogamous relationships. But primates have a very high proportion of these bonded social systems. They have a relatively high proportion of monogamous species. A lot of the South American forest primates have pair-bonded monogamy. The small titis and sarkies and the calatricids, the marmosets, and the tamarins, all these are predominantly pair-bonded monogamous mating systems. So they have quite a high representation here, but the really big difference is this very high proportion of bonded social systems in which you've got very, very close relationships between individuals, typically between females rather than between males. And when we looked at the rate of evolution across time of brain size, the rate of encephalization, the rate at which brain size increased across time for a whole set of these groups, so here they all are. This is 100 million years ago. This is last year, 0 million years ago. This is the whales and dolphin group here, the primates, the perissodactyl ungulates, the carnivores, the artiodactyl ungulates, and the insectivores, little things like shrews and the like. There's a very clear sense that, so these lines are the regression lines of best fit for the change in brain size over time. So this is just essentially relative brain size. So these species are all starting out with relatively small brains, in their early history, and then increasing in brain size over time in general. Well, the perception has been that brain size increases over time. What these data show is that that isn't actually true. Some groups of animals, the whales and the dolphins, the primates, the monkeys and apes, have increased brain size dramatically over time, but some groups haven't. The insectivores haven't. They're almost flatlining all the way across. Among the carnivores here, well, you can see the difference between the artiodactyl ungulates, the deer antelope family, compared to the perissodactyls, the horse tapir family of ungulates. It's quite different. It's much flatter for the deer family, much steeper for the horse family, much more primate-like, if you like. And within the carnivores here, although it's sort of intermediate, if you split the carnivores into the cat family, which includes the puma and these other species of cats, not just your little friend at home, and compare it to the dog family, which includes obviously the wolves and the jackals and the coyotes and things, then you find that the cats are much more flat like the insectivores here, and the dog family is much steeper and rather much more like the odd-toed ungulates. And trying to explain that variation, it turns out that it's almost entirely correlated. Oh, these are actually the correlation values for these slopes here. And you can see the difference between the dogs here and the cats. The cats show hardly any steepness. The dogs are much steeper and significantly steeper than a flat line. The correlation coefficient is greater than 0. But it turns out that the differences between these slopes correlate entirely or very tightly with the proportion of species that live in stable social groups. So this, on this axis here, is the proportion of species in stable social groups. This is the slope coefficient from this graph. So how quickly brain size increases with time. And here are the anthropoid primates up here. Here are the, yes, this is the very strange one. So these are the horse family here. These are the dolphins here. These are the prosimians, the lemurs and the bush babies, the galagos, carnivores, the ceratomorphs, the rhinos and so on, cats down here, and the ruminant antelope, the ruminant ungulates here. But this one is really very puzzling. It's the camel family. Who are the local camel family? Alpacas and llamas. They're very smart and very social. Don't be rude about them. They're little primates, almost. They're certainly in the league with the dolphins in terms of smartness and degree of social complexity, degree of bondedness. So that's really quite a surprising finding which we hadn't expected. It's possible this is just kind of an accident due to small sample size. So what I should say is these data points here are fossil species brain sizes all the way through. So we don't have very many fossil camelids, that family, to put in. So it's just possible that this is sort of a statistical error. But it is interesting, you know, particularly the vicuña and in particular are intensely social. None of these species have been well studied in the wild. But the work's been done on vicuña suggests that, you know, they are very, very social animals. And so in that sense, this is no surprise they come there. So there's a little bit of local natural history for you. All right, so the other key thing to remember then is also the social brain hypothesis is not just about numbers. There's been a tendency to see the social brain hypothesis as this quantitative relationship between group size and brain size. In reality, it's not. That's just the emergent property, the superficial way it's represented, as it were. What it's really about is social complexity and the complex relationships. And we have quite a bit of data now looking at different behavioral indices, which shows that you get the same set of relationships. So this is a study of mean grooming clique size, so these kind of relationships, grooming partnerships between monkeys. The size of those correlates with neocortex size, and you can see again these nice grades here with the prosimians lying over here, 2 grades of monkey, the less social monkeys and the more social monkeys, and then the apes on the outside here, here's humans up here. These are data on deception, Machiavellianism, if you like. It's these kind of problems here. The light is it's a bit light, so it's hard to see this photograph. These are actually gelada baboons that I studied for my PhD. This is a mother and her older daughter and her younger daughter. And the younger daughter is grooming the mother. The mother's bottom is sticking in the air, her head is down. She's probably asleep, being groomed, because it's very relaxing. It's like having a massage. And there's competition going on here between the 2 daughters to be mum's best friend, right? Because if you're mum's best friend, she will support you against your horrid little sister. So what this, if you can see it, what this female is doing here, the older daughter, is she's got a hand behind her little sister's head and is trying to move her away, right, so that she doesn't groom with mum, and the older sister can take over, but her head is tilted back and she's looking down to watch mother's face to make sure mother doesn't notice what's going on. Right, so these are what are called tactical deception in the primate literature. The animals are trying to outwit each other by subtle behavior, as it were, reflecting cognition underneath. So that kind of thing is plotted here on this axis. This is another example of the same thing. This is a very famous example. Hamadryas baboons observed by the Swiss primatologist Hans Kummer. And this system has a harem mating system set within a large multi-male, multi-female group. So each male has 2 or 3 females that he mates with and that he grooms with, and he guards them and protects them against takeover by the other males in the group. And he's very aggressive in defending his control over them. And if a female even strays by accident close to another male from the neighboring unit, he will attack the female and bite her on the back of the neck. And Kummer once observed a young female spend 20 minutes inching her way to get behind a big rock, behind which was the young male from the harem immediately next door. And then she proceeded to groom this young male, but all the time he noticed she kept her head above the rock, and so that she was in view of her own harem male who's sitting a few meters away feeding. And the argument is that what she's doing here is she's kind of thinking, if you like, that so long as my husband can see my head, he will think I'm just sitting here. But really, I'm enjoying the pleasures of my young lover. So she's imagining that what her male, if you like, her husband is thinking is she's sitting there like this with nothing else behind the rock. But in fact, this is true. So this is tactical deception again. And this is what plotted here. And this is relative neocortex size. So it's the same measure as here for different species of primates. And again, you can see it's much more scattered, the data, but there's the species that have big brains can do this kind of thing more often. And then this is another data set where we've looked at relative brain size for body size. So this would be 0 on here if you had the size of brain that you would expect for your body size. If you're above the line here, you've got a bigger brain than you'd expect for body size. If you're below the line, a smaller brain. And species that have coalitions, that operate regularly with coalitions, defensive coalitions, against other members of their group, not against other groups, but as buffers within the group, have much bigger brains for body size than those that don't use coalitions. So these kind of subtleties of behavior are the important things. Okay, so just a reminder again that if you plug humans into this 8th regression line, you get this predicted value of 150. That there's lots of data broadly suggesting the existence of this 150 as a natural grouping kind in humans, and that if you look at the structure of these 150s, particularly in our personal social networks, and this is from our Christmas card study again, who do people send Christmas cards to, and we've asked them to rate every single member of their social network for emotional closeness. Do you love them a lot? Are you kind of neutral to them? 0 here, just 0 to 10. And when did you last see them as a measure of frequency of contact? Was it yesterday, or was it, in this case, 8 months ago? And this is the kind of nice relationship you get. You get these kind of, also, these kind of steps which suggest that there are clusters. And if you do some clunking mathematics looking at these data, we've used the mathematics of fractal maths. So remember, fractals are these recurring patterns that were very popular in the 1980s. But the whole essence of them is you get this recurring pattern, and there's some maths you can use to describe that underlying periodicity. You apply this to our Christmas card data set, as we've done here, and to our ethnographic data set. Just whiz back. So it's this data set here. That's our ethnographic data set. That's our Christmas card data set. What you find is that you get peaks in the fractal parameter at particular values. These harmonics around that peak are not in themselves terribly important. They're just reflecting the recurring patterns. The key thing is the position of the highest peak, and in both cases it occurs at the same place. If you translate that fractal parameter back to what it means in everyday life, it gives you a scaling ratio of very close to 3. And here's another data set from another group of anthropologists in the US, showing very much the same sort of relationship at a very close to the same value. So these are hunter-gatherer data grouping sizes, and the slope on that line there, where you're putting frequency of these groups against their degree, as it were, is the same, reflecting the same thing. It's just a different way of doing the same analysis, but with a different data set. And they get pretty much a scaling ratio of 3 as well. And we've done this analysis here for a number of groups of animals. These are elephants, these are gelada baboons that I studied, these are the Hamadryas baboons, the one that was sort of, the female was deceiving her male, and these are orcas, killer whales. And again, you've got these sort of multiple levels of social groupings with sort of, here level 1 is usually a family included in an extended family, included in a community, included in a bigger population. Again, the slope on these lines is a reflection of the consistency of scaling and the scaling ratio, and these are almost exactly 3 as well. So it looks like humans and these highly social species of mammals are operating on exactly the same principles. Their social systems look like this. So here's you in the center, and so it's a bit faint in red there under this lighting. And you have a circle of 5 best friends here, a circle of 15 good friends. Well, let's put it this way. This is 5 best friends, 15 intimate friends, which includes the 5, 50 good friends, which includes these ones in here, 150 friends, and then outside that you have acquaintances. And that this circle at 150 really demarcates the difference, as I said yesterday, between relationships which are reciprocal and reciprocated and have a history to them, and those that are casual and asymmetric, essentially, and you know who they are, but they don't know who you are. So the question is then, how does this bonding process work? This sort of comes off the back of the free rider problem, because the problem, in a sense, is how to bond the community together as a whole to prevent free riders destroying the collaborative project, as it were. And primates do this through these 2 mechanisms. As I mentioned, it's a dual process mechanism. They do a lot of this kind of grooming stuff, which produces a very emotionally intense component, and then off the back of that, that provides the opportunity to develop a cognitive relationship, a relationship of trust and reciprocity with the people you do these activities with. So the role for social cognition in this is, we really don't know much about social cognition. We know a lot about it, but we don't know what it is in some sense. But the key to it is the levels of intentionality. So I'll just remind you, here's Jack in first order intentionality, Jill in second order intentionality. She believes that Jack believes that something is the case. And now Jack can be in third order intentionality. He believes that Jill believes that Jack believes that something is the case. And in principle, this goes on forever, but almost all the work has been done at this level. This is the level that children pass at age 5 to 6. So it's acquiring theory of mind, the ability to understand that another individual has a mind of their own, and therefore their view of the world isn't the same as your view of the world, or might not be. And that has 2 important consequences for children. One is they can lie convincingly, because they now understand the difference between how you see the world and how they would like you to see the world. So children up to the age of about 4 or 5, if you ask them who took all the chocolate from the fridge, will say to you, while you were out, a little green man hopped over the window of the kitchen and went into the fridge and took it all away, and I sat and watched it. Because they know, they're very skilled observers, and they know that if you're very convincing in what you say, adults will probably believe you. But what they don't realize is the chocolate here gives the game away. Right? But after the age of about 5 to 6, once they've acquired theory of mind, they can understand how your mind relates to that information. So they can start to feed you information which they know to be untrue, but will cause you to believe them better. It's a very important kind of barrier for children. The other thing it allows them to do is to engage in fictional play. Right? So below that age, when dollies have a tea party, it's kind of meaningless in some sense for children. But after about the age of 5, dollies can have real tea parties. Right? When the dolly drinks the tea, she's really drinking the tea. And they can pretend that these things are happening, even though they know they're not happening in reality. So below this point, they take reality as they see it. After this point, they invent reality. And that allows us to have fiction in the way that I suggested this morning. And indeed differentiates between normal humans and people like autistic individuals who are locked into this state here and cannot, don't go through the theory of mind barrier, as it were, and therefore cannot differentiate between the world they see and the world everybody else sees. But it turns out that adults can cope with fifth order intentionality quite competently. After that it drops away. So this is performance on pure factual tasks. The squares, the red, are performance on mind-reading tasks. And we're pretty much the same, equally competent on both up to fifth order, and then after that it just falls away very quickly for normal adults. It raises the question, though, really, what is social cognition? What is this stuff? And our suspicion is, or hypothesis, really, if you like, is it's just normal, standard, second-order cognition. So the ability to infer causal causes, causal reasoning, to engage in comparisons, metaphorical reasoning, analogical reasoning, to be able to predict into the future and to compare two different sets of predictions. So you can compare what will happen in your mind if I do this or if I do that. And your capacity to do these things, when you can do them is determined by the size of the computer you have, and the extent to which, or at least the point at which your computer is big enough to allow you to do these on a big enough scale is the point at which you see theory of mind. This theory of mind capacities pop out, because now you can model the mind of another individual. And we kind of see it as a kind of all or nothing Rubicon transition point, but in fact it's a continuum where you're kind of adding together these components. And this is essentially what this is showing here. Here's the performance levels of intentionality as we understand them. Humans at level 5, chimpanzees and the other great apes at about level 2. That's reasonable evidence they can cope with that. The monkeys in general are locked into level 1 theory of mind. It correlates very nicely with frontal lobe volume. But there is another important component of theory of mind, or not theory of mind, of cognition, that seems to be critical in all this, and critical to the way you strategize in the Machiavellian sense, as it were, and that's the extent to which you can inhibit your immediate selfish desires. Because the whole point about these implicit social systems is that your fitness is coming from two different directions. One from the resources you gain for yourself, the other from the extra resources that the group can get by virtue of collaborating. And you're trading these off between the two. And the free rider problem comes because some individuals prefer to emphasize the selfishness of part of that component and take more than they give. But they risk losing out on the collaborative community part of it because they risk destroying the community by doing so. And it turns out that this capacity to inhibit your immediate selfish responses is actually correlated with the volume of the frontal lobe in primates. So these are data on performance on inhibition of what's called prepotent action. And the tests are of the kind, if you offer a monkey or an ape a choice between two dishes, one of which has 1 peanut on and the other has 10 peanuts, then its natural instinct is to reach, as it is with children, I guess, to reach for the big one. But what you're going to do when it makes its choice and points to the one it wants, you will give it the other one. So it's got to learn to inhibit that natural instinct to go for the big one and instead choose the little one in anticipation that if it does that, if it chooses the little one, you'll give it the big one. And species like lemurs, prosimians, have great trouble with that problem. They keep doing the wrong thing. Species like apes, chimpanzees, and gorillas, it's hard for them, but they can learn to suppress that instinctive action. And humans are going to lie somewhere over here, being able to do it even better than great apes. So it looks like one of the key things making complex sociality possible is this relatively simple, you might think, cognitive strategy, which in turn is a function of how much frontal lobe grey matter you've got, and therefore the computational capacity is reflected in the neural connections that are made possible by just having more volume, more neurons to play with. And again, this is a meta-analysis of something like 8 executive function tasks, so-called. So this is causal reasoning. It includes the prepotent action tasks that I just talked about, but a number of other spatial and inferential reasoning tasks, all things that are supposed to reflect competence in frontal lobe cognition, as it were. Across 44 species of primates, what we've done is tried to model these performances on all these tasks across species to find the best predictors. And by and large, so these are different models that we've tried fitting. By far the best model is this one here. It fits about 50% of the variance in the data, and this is data for 444 animals altogether, individual animals. And the thing that comes out, the things that best predict performance are the task itself. So there are task differences. Some tasks are harder than others. That's fine. Hippocampus volume, that's really interesting because the hippocampus is tiny. But what it turns out to be important in is both memory, spatial memory in particular, and a lot of these tasks are spatial, but also in learning, sequence learning and the like. So it's no surprise, since these are all learning tasks, hippocampus should be important, but then neocortex ratio comes out as the third key factor, and then finally total brain size as a sort of balancing factor, as it were. But none of the other bits of the brain really play an important role in that. So again, there's some evidence that the importance of the neocortex as a whole, and I think the reason we're getting, just harking back to yesterday's discussion, the reason we keep getting neocortex ratio rather than other bits of the brain coming up as being important is that the neocortex is functioning in a distributed way. There's a sort of network of neurons involved that are distributed right across large chunks of the neocortex. So it doesn't kind of make sense to cut it down. It turns out that these mentalizing tasks are really difficult to do. And 2 bits of evidence to support that. These are, oh dear, that's terrible, the colors on this. These are again are standard intentionality type tasks, but they're only done over 2nd, 3rd, and 4th order. So it's something everybody should be able to do, every normal adult. So we're not taxing them. It's not too demanding, or it's not more demanding than the normal adults can cope with. And we have 2 different types of tasks here. The memory tasks in green and the blue are the mentalizing tasks. So here's second order, mentalizing tasks, memory tasks, third order, mentalizing tasks, memory tasks, fourth order, mentalizing tasks, memory tasks. And what we're really interested in is a reaction time test. How long does it take them to respond to the question, who's thinking what about who in this story? The key thing here is that, except at second order intentionality where they're about equal, mentalizing tasks are much harder to solve than pure factual memory. The facts about, just the facts of the story, you know, which individuals are involved and what did they do, as opposed to what were they thinking about was going on in the story. So there's some evidence here that mentalizing tasks take longer to process and are therefore more difficult. We're just replicating this result at the moment. And this was done in the context of doing, it's actually a prelude to doing a neuroimaging one. Originally, we needed to know how long it took to solve these tasks in order to time the neuroimaging experiment. This is the basic structure of the neuroimaging experiment. We've got these little stories, these little vignettes about somebody. Here's Emma. She worked in a greengrocer's. She wanted to persuade her boss to give her an increase in wages. So she asked her friend, who was still at school, what she should say to her boss. And Jenny suggests, tell him that the chemist near where you live wants you to work in her shop. Right? So this is Machiavellianism. So our memory questions would be questions like, Emma worked in a greengrocer's, or Emma worked in a chemist shop, yes or no. But our mentalizing questions would be of the kind, Emma wanted to persuade her boss to give her more money, yes or no. Where are we? Jenny, her friend Jenny, suggested that she say that the chemist near her wanted to give her a job, yes or no, those kind of things. So they're then being given the story. They get 20 of these questions, 10 memory questions, 10 mentalizing questions, and then they get imaged, as it were, as they're doing that. They get another story, 20 questions, during which time they're being imaged, another story. So there are 5 stories in all. So it's quite a long and complicated task, and the format is they read the story, they hear it as well at the same time. Question 1 is given, takes 7 to 11 seconds. They get a cue to respond, and then they have to give the answer, at which point they're being imaged, as it were, and then that's repeated endlessly. And when you do that, it turns out that mentalizing questions involve more neural activity than memory questions, right? Just as we found with the reaction time experiments. But what's critical here is that there's a parametric effect. The higher the order of the intentionality question, the more neural activity there is. The brain is working harder. And the key thing is that it's these areas here that are really working hardest. So the frontal pole, kind of orbital frontal cortex up here, the temporal parietal junction just behind the ear here, and the temporal pole just sort of in front of the ear with the temporal cortex. And what's important about these 3 areas is that they're the ones that are known to be involved in theory of mind. So this is showing that not only are these areas also involved in these higher orders of intentionality, but they're working harder when they're dealing with higher order intentional questions than when they're dealing with standard theory of mind questions. And this is a very gross analysis, a stereological analysis. So that's an fMRI study of the brain in action. This is a study of this is an MRI study looking at just volumetric components, and it's cutting off the prefrontal cortex here in a defined way and looking at the size of the areas in here to see which bits of the prefrontal cortex correlate best with intentionality performance on these tasks. And remember also, we're not taxing them beyond the normal level that people can do. So they're doing second, third, fourth, and fifth order intentional tasks only. This is intentional level plotted against orbital prefrontal cortex and against dorsal prefrontal cortex. So this is the bit, that's the dorsal bit there, that's the prefrontal cortex. That's the orbital prefrontal cortex down here. There's no correlation between intentional performance and dorsal prefrontal cortex, but there is with orbital frontal cortex. So the size of that bit of the brain seems to be correlated with your competencies on these kind of complex social mentalizing tasks. And this is unpublished data at the moment, but Joanne Powell, who did the stereological analysis in the last slide, has since done a second study in which all our subjects, as is often the case in neuroimaging, are all right-handed to remove left-hand, right-hand, sort of reverse brain effects. What she's done is looked at 40 left-handers and 40 right-handers. She gets the same effect for the right-handers as we got before. It's the size of the orbital frontal cortex that correlates with with intentional performance, but in left-handers, it's the dorsal prefrontal cortex. Now, the big difference between these two areas is orbital frontal cortex is tied into emotional recognition and reward, and it seems to be dealing with a much more emotional, instinctive response to these kind of social events, even though it's at a cognitive level. The dorsal prefrontal cortex seems to be much more heavily involved in kind of causal reasoning type things. And we don't quite know how to interpret these data, but as a sort of proposal, if you like, and it's no more than a proposal, it looks suspiciously as though left-handers are having to work harder, think through the implications of social events, social mentalizing events, than right-handers. Right-handers are kind of doing it instinctively. Left-handers are having to work at this much, much harder and crank it out. There's a kind of interesting parallel. We're not sure how this relates, but there's a nice and interesting parallel with some earlier work we did here on emotional cue recognition across the lifespan. So what they were doing, they were being shown pictures of people making happy faces or angry faces and neutral faces, and asked to judge them in the scanner. And they were looking to see which bits of the brain were firing up. And what it turns out is, here's the strength of the signal in the frontal cortex as a whole, is that, and this is plotted against age. So our subjects range in age from 8 up to 50 here. And there's this declining relationship in terms of the activation of the frontal cortex when you're just judging what this cue is, this face is telling you, what's the emotion being expressed here. And what we think is going on here, and other people have now shown this since then, is that there seems to be a switch in where the work is being done on interpreting these kind of emotional cues from the frontal lobes during childhood and teenagehood into other regions of the brain, the limbic system and elsewhere. And this looks suspiciously as though it's being automated. So early on, these kind of ages, you're having to crank it through up here in the frontal cortex and figure out what's going on. But then as you get older, you can start to shift it down into the kind of more automatic parts of the brain, and it's dealt with automatically rather than having to crank it out. But what's interesting is there's a suggestion that there's a key Rubicon here at about age 25 where that shift occurs, which is very late, but that's the point at which the frontal lobes finally settle down and mature. So the cognitive side of all this looks like it's really getting very complicated. Okay, so this is just a reminder. I showed these graphs yesterday that if you look at the frequency of intentional competencies, fifth order is very strikingly the most common. Some people can do sixth and seventh order quite well. Some people can only do third and fourth order. There's some variability in there, Probably the tails here are a bit artifactual, but that doesn't matter. And if you plot social group size against that, the clique size, the number of people in the 15 circle, it correlates with the intentional competence. There's a lot of variance around there, there's a lot of scatter. So this is from our neuroimaging data set, exactly the same analysis. Again, you can see this nice correlation with a lot of scatter. We know what produces a lot of that scatter because we now know that this also correlates with, independently, with extroversion and neuroticism scales in personality, and also striking sex differences. Women perform better on these tasks than men do, and have bigger clique sizes as a result. They tend to have slightly larger numbers of friends at each layer. My joke is that if you think about those layers of relationships, right, 5, 15, 50, 150, 500, 1500, there's a layer missing. Just think of the scaling ratio. What layer is missing? That should be right in there. Any guesses? 1.5. Right in the center. And why is it 1.5? Because blokes can only manage one relationship at a time. Girls can manage two. They can manage their boyfriend and a best girlfriend. And boys can only have either a girlfriend or a boyfriend. They can't manage both. And we've been looking at evidence for that. And as to whether there is a layer at 1.5. It turns out yes, but it's a bit ambivalent. Very strikingly, so this is looking at mobile telephone records for a sample of kids that we followed through over, that I talked about yesterday, we followed through over 18 months. And some of those show very, very strongly this inner circle of between 1 and 2 individuals, but not all of them. They don't all show it. But we're taking that as some evidence that there is a kind of difference here. And this goes back to a kind of joke I sometimes tell about the nature of relationships between the sexes, that if you think the social world the two sexes live in are kind of characterized by how life was like when you were about 8 or 9 or 10. Right? Now, if you think about it, you can remember back that far. If you're a girl, if your friend Susan doesn't invite you to her party, this is the end of the universe. This is a crisis of monumental proportions. Right? Your life has fallen apart. And it's all tears and depression and stuff. If you're a boy, so these are very intense relationships between two very occasionally 3 girls perhaps, but particularly dyadic, tightly bonded, best friends, I'm your best friend syndrome. If you look at what happens with boys at this stage, a relationship consists of standing on opposite sides of the road, kicking a football backwards and forwards. Now, I maintain that it doesn't matter whether it's a little boy standing on the other side of the road and kicking the ball back, or the wall. As long as the football comes back to you, that's a relationship for boys. And I'm not sure it ever changes. Okay, so again, I showed these data yesterday just to highlight this, that we get this very striking correlation between intentional performance and orbital frontal cortex here, but the correlation with network size is up here with dorsal prefrontal cortex, and these 2 areas are clearly very adjacent to each other, and sort of this is doing the cranking work on your network, this is doing the automatic stuff that you need to support that. And then when we did a voxel-based morphometry analysis, so this is an MRI analysis, this is a voxel-based morphometry analysis study looking in very small scale detail at what's going on, we get pick up these activity in relation to both intentionality and network size in all the 3 of the classic theory of mind areas, the 2 on the temporal lobe and up here in the frontal cortex. But you get a complete overlap here, just on the edge of this boundary here between these 2. It's medial frontal cortex, where the signature for both of these 2 measures, intentionality and friendship, number of friends coincide very, very strongly. So again, it's suggesting that what's critical here has been the evolution of these large frontal cortices. How are we doing? Right, 10 minutes. Okay, grooming time, I talked about that this morning. I talked about this yesterday, just a reminder that the amount of time you spend interacting with people is very important for friends, particularly these data here. The amount of time you spend interacting with them determines whether or not a relationship fails or succeeds. Not so with kinship. And here's another expression of that. So this is looking at the inner core of 5. This is what happens. This is the range of closest friends you have for people who are not in a romantic relationship. The average is exactly 5. Some people have lots, some people have a few, but it's very tightly clustered around that. For people who are in a romantic relationship, they lose one best friend. They only have 4 in that inner core, not 5. This is at the peak of the romantic relationship, those few years when the romantic relationship is very, very exciting and so on. It's because all their time and attention is focused on this other person, and they don't have time for their friends. Right? So they've lost one friend, at least. But if you think about it, where is your romantic partner come from, your boyfriend or your girlfriend? It's not come from the inner 5. You don't usually start a relationship with your best friends. It's quite rare. Usually your romantic partner comes from outside. So what this data are telling us is having a romantic relationship costs you 2 friends in reality. You're having to kick 2 out. It turns out that one of them is nearly always family, and you can do that, get away with that, because family are more robust. It's not so costly in the long run, but you are sacrificing one actual friend who is never going to forgive you. So you have a choice. Think about it. But it's just a reminder of how, and this is a consequence of the fact that building and maintaining those kind of romantic relationships is very costly in terms of your time. Grooming works because of endorphins. Here's that, I showed this yesterday, so I'm just reminding you really, this nice experiment by BACRP showing that it's endorphins that are critical to interest in grooming. And it raises the question about what the neuroendocrine basis of these are, because there's been a lot of fuss about the role of oxytocin as the love hormones or pair bonding hormone, supposedly. Oxytocin in women, vasopressin in men. Both of them, they're kind of related to each other, but they are both involved originally, ancestrally, in water balance. So oxytocin is very much tied up with lactation in female mammals, all about water balance. And the argument is that it's been co-opted, both of these have been co-opted in the 2 sexes to underpin bonded relationships. And all this was based on data on North American voles, members of the insectivores. Now the problem is, that's all very well. There are 2 problems, however, here. One is that vasopressin in particular turns out not to be correlated with monogamy in voles as a whole. It just so happened in the 2 species or 3 species they looked at, the species which had pair-bonded relationships, the prairie vole in particular, the males had a gene for a high density of vasopressin receptors in the brain. And in the species which were promiscuous and didn't have pair-bonded monogamy, the males didn't. But it turns out, in actual fact, if you look across the voles as a whole, the whole family, the relationship is actually the reverse way round. Got nothing to do, monogamy has nothing to do with vasopressin at all. So it may not, the story may not hold water. Huge amount of press interest and great excitement, and lots of careers were made on this. But there is another issue, and that's the question of whether voles are an adequate model of primates, pair bondedness, never mind humans. And given all that I told you about the nature of sociality and cognition across the mammals, you have to wonder whether this simple, very simple rodent is a good model for what happens in these cognitively very advanced and socially very advanced species like primates. So Barry Cavern, many years ago, and I just follow in his footsteps really, argued that what happened is these kind of neurotransmitters may well be involved in pair bonding in some sense, and even in monkeys and humans be still involved in this to some extent. But the need to develop these really intense pair-bonded relationships and friendships in primates required something that was more robust, because the problem with these effects is they die away very quickly, even in the effect only lasts for a matter of a couple of weeks at the most in things like guinea pigs and voles. Whereas you need lifelong relationships in primates. Something else that's stronger and can carry the weight of that is needed, and that's provided by endorphins, the endorphin system, which is part of the pain control system. And this really goes back to two people in particular, I think, who proposed it some years ago, but were largely ignored or treated as stupid, probably. One was Michael Leibovitz, an American psychiatrist, who from clinical observation came to this conclusion that there was a great deal of similarity between addiction to drugs and being in a romantic relationship. It was like being addicted to something. It had all the same characteristics. And then Jaap Panksepp, the neuroscientist in kind of somewhere in the Midwest, I think he is, in his book, and all his research has been geared to a lot of this, came to a very similar conclusion that endorphins are playing a really critical role. And again, it was partly based on the observation that there was deep similarity between pain, physical pain, and social pain, the loss, the pain you feel on separation. And in fact, his arguments have been borne out by neuroimaging experiments by a number of people, which show that exactly the same areas are involved in physical pain and social pain, rejection. So if we go back to humans and grooming time, again, just going to remind you very quickly, social time is correlated with group size in primates. This is the upper limit for primates. Humans would have to devote that amount. We have, in fact, we spend this amount. Something else is bridging this gap. And my argument is that although language comes into play, it's only half the story, because language doesn't give you this endorphin kick. The endorphin kick has to come from physical stress on the body. It's a response to pain, and you can't produce that with language unless you're, deeply insulting to your best friends. But most of the time, at least in a positive sense, for promoting bonding, it's impossible to do that. You're not producing. So you need something which is more stressful. And our suggestion is that these came in successively as laughter, which we share with great apes, the performance of music and dancing, and the rituals of religion here, and that they came in pretty much in that order. And endorphins, I think, are probably really critical in a lot of the rituals of religion, because a lot of them involve serious infliction of pain. Here are the two sort of classic examples. One is flagellation. Remember the medieval flagellants in Europe during the time of the Black Death, the Great Plague, going around Europe, whipping themselves. It's a sort of Opus Dei type activity. Practiced or to some lesser extent now, it used to be in a lot of Catholic monasteries, and monks and nuns, flagellating themselves in penance, as it were. It's very common in sects of Islam and the Shia sects. You have these great ceremonies in Iran in particular, where a whole population marches from one tomb of one martyr to the tomb of another martyr, whipping themselves over their back with thongs till they bleed. These kind of activities, just the tip of the iceberg, because most religious rituals involve physical stress on the body, kneeling, awkward postures like that, standing for long time periods. In some religions, dancing. In Coptic Christianity, for example, as you have in Ethiopia, the deacons sing and dance before the altar in sort of traditionally. These are so-called whirling dervishes, an Islamic Sufi sect. The Sufis are the mystical branch of Islam. They're very much discriminated against by the Shia and Sunnis, who are the kind of thought police, if you like, for Islam. The Sufis use, in this case, is twirling dances to create an ecstatic state. They go into an ecstatic trance as a result of it. When they come out of it, you kind of feel very, better. And this is very similar to trance dancing in hunter-gatherers, who use this particularly, specifically, to rebond the community. If things are getting, relationships are getting sort of difficult and people are falling out with each other, they'll have a trance dance, and after that everybody feels much better and they're all happy with each other again. And sort of here, just to sort of relate that to the trance states that all these religions have, is Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa. Sort of trance, these kind of mystical experiences are fundamentally important in all these religions, not just the Abrahamic ones. In Buddhism and so on, you have yoga techniques designed to create these, explicitly create these trance states. And these seem to be involved in, we think anyway, the release of endorphins. They just make you much more content. And some of our evidence, again, which I showed yesterday, so I'm not going to go through it, that music and laughter have the effect of increasing pain thresholds, suggesting that endorphins are being released, that laughter makes you more generous towards strangers. But the issue is, if these effects are true, and they work, you get this endorphin release from stressing the body in this way, and if you're a jogger, you know about this, or if you pump iron like this in the gym every day, what you're getting and what's making you really happy for the rest of the day is the endorphin release you're getting off the back of this. So if this is all there is to it, why don't we just go down the gym? Why do we need religion, if you like? Well, why don't we just go down the gym every day and pump iron, put your earphones on, you don't have to talk to anybody, and you get a nice endorphin surge? And the answer, I think, is that what you don't get is the sense of doing it with a group of people. That if you do it on your own, yes, you get an endorphin surge and you feel better for it, and you write much better term papers. But you don't feel that you belong to a community. You have to do these activities as a group. And our demonstration of this was based on using this kind of rowing, sweep-oared rowing in eights, which the very famous boat race between Oxford and Cambridge universities, which Oxford won this year, it's very important to know, is symptomatic of. And this is the whole point about these races, is these crews are all equally powerful. They're very big guys, they're highly trained, many of them are international oarsmen for their own countries, and there's not a lot of difference in power between the boats. What's critical to this boat race, it's a very long boat race, several miles up the Thames against the water coming down, so they're rowing upriver. So it's very, very taxing and very demanding, and I think it's about a 16 or 18-minute race. It's a long, long boat race, and under these very grueling conditions, the key to success is how long they can remain synchronized. Because if the oars get out of synchrony with each other, you lose power enormously, and you risk, you can lose the race in the first 100 meters by just having your 8 oars not in synchrony right at the start. So what we did is we've got the guys from the Oxford boat crew, which are these lot here. There are 2 boats and there are 2 races. There's the first boat and the second boat. The first boat, which is this lot, is the famous one, but before they race, the second teams race first. So there are altogether 16 of them. So we had, I think, 12 out of the 16. Every morning they exercise and practice on these machines for an hour, I think it is. They get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and they train on these machines for an hour, and then they go and row on the river for an hour. And then when they come into class at 10 o'clock, they're asleep. I mean, seriously, this is how we discovered this was such a great study, because we had the captain of the boat team doing our master's course. And the class was every, whatever it was, Thursday at 10 o'clock, the main class, seminar class, and he would be asleep on the table by 10:15. So eventually, after several weeks, I thought, time I asked what the problem is, why are you always asleep? And he said, well, I have to get up at 5 every morning and spend several hours training. And they're doing this from October through till Easter when the race is, just in preparation for that one race. So he did this project for us, basically. This was actually his master's project. He got the guys, and of course, because he was the captain, he could make them do it. Very important to choose your study subjects carefully. They would do, on some days, they would do just this on their own, no connection, and then on other days, I think they did this 5 times, actually, in a week, and then the second week, they did it as a group, linked up, because you can link the machines up, so they're a virtual boat. And also because they're professionals and because of the little computer here, we can tell them, row at exactly the same pace, power output, as you on every day. And they can do it, and we can check it to make sure they are. Right, so they do this once, 1 week. The next week, they do it as a virtual boat, and then they repeated it all again the following 2 weeks. And here are the data. Here's on their own. Here's 0 difference between pain threshold before they do the workout, the 45-minute workouts they're doing, and afterwards there's a nice uplift, the blue line. But when they're doing it in a group, as a boat, they're not working any harder, but suddenly they're getting this massive uplift from doing it together because they can sense this coordination, this synchrony. They're getting twice as much endorphin out. And so when they finish these tasks, the training and the boat race, they just love each other, you know. It's a wonderful effect. We haven't tested them yet to see if they're more generous to each other, but our suggestion is that this is the origin of the effect that people like Durkheim, the sociologist, identified as very important in traditional small-scale societies, what he called effervescence, this sense of excitement you get from doing these rituals together, dancing and so on. That this produces, this exercise done as a group produces this upsurge in endorphin production and makes you feel that you're part of the group. So it's not language that's critical, language is coming in much later, but what is bridging the period between the sort of 20% upper limit for primates in terms of grooming time and the appearance of language much, much later are these kind of physical activities like singing together, like dancing together and so on, which are producing this sense of community. And so I just take the opportunity to thank some of the many people who've worked on these various projects over the years. And thanks very much. We'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Professor Dunbar. We will have about 15 minutes for a coffee break. Tendremos 15 minutos para un café en la parte exterior del salón y nos encontramos dentro de 15 minutos para que ustedes presenten sus preguntas. Buenas tardes, estimados amigos y amigas. Tenemos entonces, pues, algo menos de 1 hora para preguntas, así que aprovechen para formular preguntas al profesor Dunbar porque no sabemos cuándo volveremos a tener la suerte de tenerlo en el Perú. No.
Gracias. Yeah. How close do you think the correlation is a parallel between the evolution of language in animals and the development of language and brain connections for language, starting from this stage in uterus, and then infancy, and then childhood, and then adolescence. Let me ask you with some detail. We know that in infancy, the first thing, the first aspect is the prosody,
yes, prosody, yeah.
And then the lexical,
yep.
And then the syntactical. And at the 3 years, most children have acquired those 3. What about the development of these aspects in evolution of animals.
Okay. I mean, there is a view, or has been a view in biology, evolutionary biology, that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. That's the way it's expressed. In other words, and I think this goes back to the German biologist Haeckel in the 19th century, that if you want to, you can observe the evolutionary stages of animal evolution by looking at what happens as the embryo develops towards the adult. And the famous example of that is the fact that if you look at the fetus, a human fetus, very young fetus, and the fetus of an embryo of a dog, or the embryo even of a chicken probably, of the same equivalent age, it's impossible to tell the difference between them. But gradually they start to diverge and become more like their adult species eventually. So there is the view that you should be able to see these sequences being replayed. Some biologists regard this as disreputable, 19th century rubbish, and don't like it at all. And I think the jury is still undecided in biology as to whether this is true. But that said, I think that maybe this prompted your question. We were talking just outside about the fact that in gelada baboons, the species I did my PhD on in Ethiopia, they're very, very intensely vocal. And this is because they live in a very, very big group. Herds of 200 animals, sometimes 300 animals. But within that, you have this structure with small harems of a male with 3 or 4 or 5 females, plus their young, who stay together. And keeping these little harem groups together in this very big complex herd is a challenge for them. It's difficult. It's unlike the Hamadryas baboon, where the males enforce it. In the gelada, it's done by the females. It's done not by enforcement, but they do it amongst themselves to keep together. And so they are constantly talking to each other. And it's just exactly that kind of prosodic aspects of language that you hear there. Because I was saying, you can sit at the back of a herd of gelada and you hear these murmurings. They're moans, sort of kind of vocalization, but they're full of intonation and rising and falling contours, as it were. And it's like sitting at the back of a restaurant and hearing conversation. You can't hear what people are saying, but you can hear the rise and fall of the voices, and the voices coordinating with each other and replying and so on. And so I guess there might be an analogy there between the early evolution of those kind of activities. They're already present. Those components of language are already present in some of the more intensely social monkeys and apes. Bonobos, possibly very similar. They're another very, very vocal primate. And a parallel, as it were, to what you're seeing during development, with that kind of prosody babbling coming first. And I guess it also fits quite well with the kind of sequence I sketched here of laughter and music. And by music, I'm really thinking of singing as a major component, or also dancing too, but singing, kind of humming round the campfire without words as a sort of precursor to the evolution of language. It's also a view that's been promoted by Stephen Mython, the archaeologist, independently of me. We both wrote books saying exactly the same thing at the same time and didn't know that. Even though we know each other well, we didn't realize that. We kept our books to ourselves. So, I would say, maybe. I'm not sure whether this is biologically acceptable these days or not. Biologists vary in their views about ontogeny versus phylogeny, as it were. But it seems to me you can make a case that at least it's paralleling it, even if nothing else. Yeah. Oh, are you not picking me up very well? Okay.
Well, I have two questions.
This is the easy one and the difficult one. Yeah.
According to developmental psychologists, the attachment relationship constitutes the best scenario for the development of the social brain in infants, and therefore for the development of early social cognition. Babies' preference for human faces, babies' early capacity to engage in actions with their caretakers, the capacity for joint attention, the capacity to engage in proto-conversations and to participate in contingent communication with caretakers, the capacity to share affects and intentions, and so on, are good examples of the relational framework in which early social cognition develops. My question is, to what extent the insights provided by this research area are taken into account in your model for explaining the evolution of social bonding? This is one.
Okay.
And the other one, mirror neurons are said to be a sort of embodied simulator, something that allows an agent to participate of an observer's experience in its own body. It makes possible to attribute intentions to an agent just by observing his actions, but not necessarily helps in explaining the reason behind the action. Mirror neurons tell us what an agent is going to do, but not why, because the why needs a theory of mind. So in your opinion, what are the limits of the explanatory power of mirror neurons for the evolution of social bonding?
Okay. On the first question, it seems to us anyway that what's really critical in the development, well, it's a hardware-software problem, and I kind of alluded to this a little bit yesterday, I think, in response to one of the questions. At one level, it's true, you have to have a bigger computer to do these things. If you haven't got a big enough computer, it limits what you can do. That's just in the nature of computational neuroscience as well as real computers, you know. If you only have a Nintendo Game Boy, you can't do really complex modeling or whatever. You have to have a decent computer. Even though they landed men on the moon with a computer the size of a Nintendo Game Boy when NASA was doing the moon landings. It's frightening. But, you know, and so we can see that relationship coming out in these graphs. But it's one thing to have the hardware, you've got to have the software in there. And that software requires, in effect, it's the equivalent of software programming, but it's actually, in computers, it's by programming. In the case of organisms, it's experience that produces this. So you have to have these experiences of real life, real interactions, to allow you to develop the skills to handle that complex social world. Now, there are two very nice bits of data that bear on that, I think. One was the demonstration by Tracy Joffe, who was one of my research groups some years ago, that if you look at brain size in primates, it's well known that brain size is determined by what's called the period of parental investment. So that's gestation plus lactation. That correlates with brain size in all mammals, and particularly primates. So it's reflexively laid down at a constant rate. You can't speed it up. If you want a big brain, the only way you can do it is to make your babyhood longer. And that's what, you know, sort of in effect we do. That's why, you know, children don't grow up till they're 25. You know, parental investment doesn't stop until then. What she showed was, although that was true for the brain as a whole, if you just look at the neocortex, and she removed the visual cortex as much as she could, so trying to look at the more social brain, if you like, the best predictor of that across primates is not the period of parental investment, but the period of socialization. That's the period between weaning and puberty, right? So, and what that struck me when she showed this finding was that it was exactly this issue of software implementation. Here was this period when your genes had given you, and parental investment in terms of milk and all this kind of stuff had produced the computer for you. Now you had the problem of fine-tuning the software for it, and this took a very, very long time. The other piece of data that bears on this is a study by Kerry Lewis showing that the ratio of social play to instrumental play, solo play and play with objects, across primates correlates with neocortex ratio as well. So species that have a big neocortex engage in much more social play and much less solo play and playing with objects. And again, this struck me as being important to the learning of social skills, this, sort of through, if you like, childhood. So it seems to me that's a very important part of the story, and often it gets forgotten about, and even I'm guilty of that. For example, I didn't mention it at all in any of my talks. And part of the problem I have now, is the story is just so big. If you try and do everything, you end up with a 10-hour lecture. The other thing you asked about is mirror neurons. And as I kind of understood what you were kind of, or infer anyway, what you were wanting to suggest is that mirror neurons are very important in allowing you to understand the intentions and mind state in a way of another individual, what is their actions, but that it in a sense it's producing a lower limit rather than a driver for it. In other words, you've got to have it. It's a constraint. If you didn't have mirror neurons and what information you can acquire that way, you would never be able to have intentionality, because the mirror neurons provide the basis for that kind of information. I think that's absolutely right, not least because we know that monkeys like macaques have mirror neurons too. That's where they were discovered by Rizzolatti and so on. So we know that certainly the smart primates and humans all have these things, and they must play a very important role in their socialization. But I think it's true that it's not the explanation. The Rizzolatti lab would like you to believe that this is the answer to everything, including language. And the answer is, sure, it's important, but it's not the whole story. It's just part of it.
I would like to know what kind of definition are you using for monogamous relationships, especially because I think you've made very clear what kind of advantages a group has with cooperation. But what about deception? What about the ability to choose a mate because of the genes it can give your descendants, but at the same time choosing another mate that can support you financially and socially, and having them both cheating, deceiving?
Okay, a very good question. I guess what we're thinking of in terms of monogamy here is what's sometimes called social monogamy as opposed to genetic monogamy. Right? The difference is sometimes the two coincide. So in mammals that are monogamous, and many of the small South American forest monkeys are monogamous in this sense, both pairs seem to defend their mate against rivals of the same sex as their mate. It's very intense. Titi monkeys will sit together with their tails entwined together. It's very romantic. And also, then the offspring are nearly always fathered by the male of the pair. So that's the limiting case. But it's clear that these can diverge such that one should distinguish between social monogamy, the bonding side of it, the pair bond commitment, and the genetic monogamy, the breeding monogamy that determines whether or not the offspring is the offspring of the male. Birds have a particular problem, well-known problem with that, or at least there's a lot of evidence for what are called extra-pair copulations and then extra-pair conceptions. This is because birds have rather odd reproductive biology in that the female can store sperm from different males and then fertilize each egg by the sperm of a different male. The eggs are laid usually one day at a time, one each day. And they can take the sperm from a different male in their sperm storage tract and fertilize it's not a last in, first out principle. They actually can select, it seems, which male is going to fertilize which egg. And that creates a problem for male birds that's almost as bad as it is in mammals, where the gap between fertilization and birth is even bigger. But there are very nice data showing, and this is Nick Davis's work that I was talking about just at tea, showing that in dunnocks, the hedge sparrow, which is a very small sparrow, British sparrow, the males can judge exactly what the likelihood that the clutch of eggs are fathered by them, and are very accurate in predicting what proportion of the eggs are theirs. And they adjust how hard they work, bringing insects back to feed the young in exactly the right proportion. But they do it on the basis of how long the female was out of their sight during the mating period, and therefore what the risk is that she's mated with another male. So the fun example of this in mammals is the Mongolian gerbil. Because the Mongolian gerbil mates with the male next door and lives with her brother, and the brother helps to raise the children. So it's a problem. It's clearly the case that lots of things we do are kind of designed to try and ensure that that doesn't happen too often. Because essentially it's genetic altruism if you raise other males' offspring if they're not related to you. It's different if they're related to you, right? So there are some nice, so the Mongolian gerbil is the obvious example, because the male that does the parenting is the female's brother, and therefore he has a genetic stake in the offspring. Now, the other nice example of this in primates are the tamarins and the marmoset monkeys from the Amazon basin. I think they occur in Peru too, on the Amazon side of Peru, because there's some very nice studies that were done here. What seems to happen there is that it's a monogamous mating system, but in cases where there's high female mortality and there aren't enough females to go around, the males in particular will stay in their family groups and become helpers at the nest. So usually the male does the caring of the baby. All the mother does is act like a milk machine. And for 10 minutes, every so often, the babies come onto her, take milk, and then the male comes and takes the babies away when he thinks they've had enough. And he does all the nappy changing, all the bathing, all these kind of things that are appropriate for monkeys. But if the females are in short supply, because the mortality rate for females is high, then what happens is the males who don't have females will stay in their natal group, act as helpers, and this allows the father to move on, and so you get a form of serial monogamy going on, in which the infants are raised essentially by their older brothers in particular, and the male goes off and finds a new female and mates with her, and then leaves the rearing to the previous set of offspring. In the certain knowledge, not in conscious knowledge, but in certain knowledge biologically, that the carers will care for the infants because they have a biological stake in the infants, and it may be their only opportunity to promote the propagation of their genes, because they themselves may never be able to breed. So these kind of systems do exist, and of course famously in anthropology, this is exactly what happens in societies, traditional societies that are matrilineal, which are very common in the Pacific area. And what those societies seem to be associated with is very high levels of paternity uncertainty and very high levels of promiscuity, because the males cannot control the mating behavior of their women. So what happens in here, these cases, is males do not invest in their wife's children. They invest everything in their sister's children because they know they're related to their sister's children. And that's called the not the leveret. What is it? The leveret. It's very common. It occurred. The other nice example, which is a sort of fun example really, it's just a casual observation. In Europe in the medieval period, you had the romantic poets known as the troubadours, right? Especially in Spain and France, where they're big centers. And romantic courtly love, you pined for the unobtainable, beautiful woman. And you have all these chivalric tales then that grew up in the same period of young men who had to, in order to win the hand of the bride, they had to go off and do, future bride, they had to go off and do some task, kill a dragon or something like this. And a very taxing task, and they had to be given advice and given the horse and given the armor to go and do it. The person in all these tales who gives them the armor and gives them the advice is their uncle, their mother's brother. Right? The father, married to the mother, doesn't appear in the story hardly ever until right at the end, when the boy comes back. He's killed the dragon, now he's won the hand of this damsel. And then the father appears from nowhere and says, "Yes, that's my boy." But that's all he does. And I kind of look at this and I go, aha, courtly love, well, maybe it wasn't so courtly. Great deal of paternity uncertainty. Here's exactly that same system again, that when you can't be sure that your offspring are actually your own because there's a high level of promiscuity, then the best thing to do is to invest in your sister's offspring, and you want to do some mating because that's kind of fun. So you kind of do it, and you know, that's the pleasure side, and then the work side is to back into your own family, as it were. So these arrangements can get very, very complicated, not just in humans, but also in some of the other mammals as well. But it all goes back to the fact that if you're genetically investing in somebody else's children, you are being genetically altruistic, as it were, at the expense of your genes. You're promoting somebody else's genes, and your genes are losing out. But a kind of interesting aside, actually, some mathematical analyses of this problem of paternity uncertainty shows that in humans, you should tolerate, this is not advice to you girls, from the boys, right? But boys should tolerate about a quarter of the children their partner has being fathered by another male. Up to that, it's worth the risk. If it goes beyond that, it starts to be too costly, and you should withdraw from the arrangement. See, what I do, research I do is just fun.
Any other questions?
Exhaustion.
I'd like to ask you a couple of things. I am curious about the way you see the causal relations between psychic processes, like for instance mind reading, metacognition, mirror neurons, and language. What I am wondering is this: is it that some mind reading abilities were selected originally, and they produced as a byproduct metacognition and probably language? Or do you think that both of them evolved simultaneously? That is part of the question. The other part of the question is this: it is well known that autistic children have less amount of oxytocin and also less amount of mirror neurons. So, and of course it is well known as well that they have strong social interaction handicaps. So could we claim that the evolution of mirror neurons could trigger the development of these other capacities, like for instance metacognition and language? That's one question. And the other question is something which is not so closely related to what you said today, but of course is in the grounds of it. What is your view about the mind-brain problem? Are you a functionalist? Are you a physicalist, sorry? Are you a property dualist? How do you see yourself in regards to that?
I'll answer the second question first. Confused. And I'm not sure, I kind of go back, and I say confused because in a sense, I don't know what the answer is, I don't know. I guess if I take a view, it'll be as a kind of physicalist. The mind is the brain in action, as it were, and that's it. But on the other hand, I'm also happy to be slightly neutral about that because it's a kind of empirical question, and we might be able to sort that out one day. And my defense would be back to Tinbergen's 4 whys, because that allows you to get off that hook and leave the mind-body problem to philosophers. And this is a very important strategy in science, what I call the crutch theory of science, so a crutch for helping you walk when you've broken your leg. The difference between scientists and philosophers and the way they think and work is, roughly speaking, this, in my observation anyway. Philosophers worry a great deal about definitions. So they want to have everything defined very carefully before they get started. This is very meritorious, and it's very important that somebody does that work. But scientists get very bored with that because they like poking things and seeing what happens when you poke it. So their view is, well, we don't really understand what we're talking about here, and we're not sure about the definitions, but never mind, let's just poke things, and maybe we'll find out what the definition is afterwards by what happens when you poke things. So I call this the crutch theory of science, in the sense that they take the view that, well, it doesn't matter. We have a road to walk along. We don't have very good legs, but never mind, we can use these artificial aids to assist us. This is, if you like, the scientific method. And it will get us somewhere. If we just do things to the physical world, it will give us some answers of some kind, and we can try and make sense of it afterwards. So in that sense, I see these as very useful complementary activities. The philosophers are worrying about the definitions on the side, and we can leave them to do that. And then the scientists can get on with some practical things on the other side. So they're not opposites, they're complementary. The issue of, and in fact, we've kind of done this to look at primate brain evolution. So we've taken all the different components that people have suggested correlated with brain evolution and done an enormous great path analysis, which allows us to look at the causal sequences involved between these different components. And what this was very valuable in doing was differentiating between causes and consequences and constraints. Those are the 3 key things, so in evolutionary terms. So you've got a cause, in a functional sense, a selection pressure, which is selecting for a trait, larger group size in the case of primates, to solve an ecological problem. That's predominantly predation risk. Primates solve that by living in bigger and bigger groups. But to do that, they had to solve the problem simultaneously of the cognition required to allow them to live in big groups, to tolerate other individuals very close to them, to coordinate their behavior with them. And in turn, to do that, they have to solve at the same time the brain size problem, because they've got to have the computer big enough and complex enough to actually solve those problems in order to live in these kind of groups. So this is a very complex, tight, co-evolutionary set of arrangements between these effects. And we can show with, you can do this now, we have really very, very powerful statistics available for comparative phylogenetic analysis. Have been developed in the last 10 years, really, which allow you to look at the sequential changes in different traits along phylogenies over evolutionary time and see when one trait changes, does the other trait change at the same time or later? And what we were able to show with carnivores and ungulates and primates is you get a very tight correlation between brain size and sociality. So as sociality increases, it's paralleled by an increase in brain size in all three groups. But the big difference between primates on the one hand and carnivores and ungulates on the other was that the correlation was much sloppier. It was very significant, but it was much sloppier for these other groups. So sometimes brain size changed first, and then it took a long time for social group size to change. Or sometimes social group size changed first, and it took a long time for brain size to change first. In primates, you almost never see that. When one trait changes, the other trait changes at the same time, at least insofar as we can define time phylogenetically in these terms. You also see this in birds. Birds really split into two groups. Those who have, well, as you probably well know, those who have young that are capable of feeding as soon as they come out of the egg, like chickens, and young that need to be fed by the parents for a while before they can cope on their own. So these are the, what do they call it? Lost the words. But anyway, what turns out is that these two styles of development correlate very tightly with a whole suite of other characters, with length of, with brain size. The species that have babies that are not very mature at birth have big brains, with pair bondingness, and with biparental care, both parents feeding the offspring, and a number of other traits. And these traits all change together at the same time. You don't get one in the course of bird evolution. So the birds literally get divided into those which have small brains, young that can feed at birth, no pair bonding, promiscuous mating relations, no biparental care, so on, and then the other group have all of these things. And it's as though they just flip-flop from one state to the other, all at the same time. And this is a very tight co-evolutionary process, which suggests that there are constraints on one part of the system such that you can't make a change in it unless you change everything else at the same time. So that's very demanding in evolutionary terms. But so it raises then this whole issue of constraints. So in terms of brain evolution, you can't grow a big brain unless you have more, and this is the argument for humans, the so-called expensive tissue hypothesis. Humans in our evolutionary history couldn't evolve these very big brains we have unless we solved the dietary problem of free energy through basically coming through the mother, to allow extra energy to be put into the baby for brain growth, particularly after birth. But also going through, because brain development continues to go on for a very long time before it finally settles down, after the infant is weaned, even ensuring that it has enough spare energy to put into brain growth as opposed to just survival, sort of bodily survival. And that required a change in diet. It required a shift from a reduction in the size of the guts. So we have very small intestines compared with most vegetarian primates. And that's only possible if you have a much richer energy-richer diet. One argument is that's the shift to meat eating, because meat is much higher energy content per kilogram than vegetation, which is hard to get energy out of. That's, say, usable energy per kilogram. The other argument, Richard Wrangham's argument, is that it's indicative of the origins of cooking and fire. That cooking releases energy in things like meat in particular, but also vegetable foods and makes it much, much more accessible to us. And that those transitions were essential to allow humans to develop our big brains. So these constraints issues become very important. Extending the period of brain growth over a much, much longer period is essential, because you can't speed up the rate at which neural material is laid down. The only way you can get a bigger brain is to allow the brain to develop over this longer period. And so it allows you to separate out the causal effects from the selection effects from the constraints that the animals also have to solve at the same time, and from the consequences that emerge as a result of having big brains in other areas. So this is the kind of Jeff Miller sexual selection argument, as I see it, opening up, once you've got a big brain, it opens up other opportunities. So the causality, I think the short answer, that's the long answer to your question. The short answer is simply that understanding the structure of these complex biological systems and having a systemic approach becomes very important to seeing the different relationships, causal relationships involved in the various components. So, going back to the mind-body problem, it then becomes very unclear to me, and I don't care what your, in one sense I'm going to say, I don't care what your answer is. It may not matter too much to what we do. That does it, the cognition side and the brain side of the story are two bits, and we can fit them together somehow. And there must be some very complex relationship between them that's very important in a philosophical sense. But we can do a lot of work without having to worry too much about that. And Tim Bergen, thank you.
This my brain problem is a very difficult one, but you are saying that you are doing your research and your proposals, your discoveries, despite you are confused about the mind-brain problem. But then, do you think, how do you think are related the brain and the body of a dog, a cat, a pigeon? Do you feel, or do you have any idea about if these animals have any kind of mind? And then, what is the mind from your point of view? And to Pablo, there are some initial difficulties about this mind-brain problem. If we ask several of the people who are in this room about what they think the mind is, they will have at least 3 or 4 concepts. And then, if you ask them what do they think the brain is, they will also have 3 or 4 concepts. Then, which brain concept you correlate with which mind concept? It's like we feel that we are talking about the same mind and that we are talking about the same brain. That's not true.
Yes.
That's one of my, that's my doctoral thesis.
I agree. And this is sort of, I suppose this is the base of my argument is that it is so complex that if we just worry about trying to sort that out, we will never get any observational experimental, empirical work done. And in some sense, it's better, to do the two simultaneously and not worry too much about it. So that if I really have to think about it, I'll say, okay, the brain, the mind is the brain in action and nothing more than that. It's just what happened, how you experience neurons firing, to borrow Dan Dennett's analogy here. But there is a sense, and you're right, that there are also several definitions of the brain are possible and several definitions of the mind, and they don't necessarily correlate with each other, and it becomes a big mess. This becomes very relevant, I think, in the context of the fact that, well, it's embodied cognition. That's what I was really thinking in terms of here. And this becomes very critical, in my view, in terms of this whole bonding process, social bonding process that we suddenly realize we actually don't understand. And the reason I think we don't understand is because it's primarily an emotional thing. It's got very little to do with cognition. We rationalize it and we think about it sometimes, but mostly it's an emotional response, and therefore it's a kind of right brain, and this crude division caricature of it. It's a right brain thing. It doesn't connect very well with the left brain language side. So in the notorious case that we find it very difficult to express how we're feeling, express our emotions. And therefore, because we can't express it in language, it's very difficult to think about it and cognize about it and describe it, and therefore we don't have a very good metric for it that we can measure pair bond or bond strength between different individuals, and that means we can't compare the functionality of different relationships in humans. I can't tell whether my relationship with my wife is better or worse than your relationship with your wife, and then measure some consequences to see whether there are, consequences for biological consequences that come out of that. And not only can we not do that for humans, we can't do that comparison across species that have basically pair-bonded mating, monogamous type mating systems. So we can't compare, in general, the strength and quality of pair bonds in humans with the quality and strength of pair bonds in gibbons, to take a primate example of a very pair-bonded species, and again with the quality of pair bonds in, say, Klipspringer antelope, the small antelope from Africa, which has very, very intense pair bonds. We just have no way of describing it that gives us a good metric. And it's because these are largely kind of emotional things. And when they're in that kind of, and this is where the endorphin story becomes critical to this, that when it's driven by these kind of neuropeptide activation, it's not quite doing the same job as cranking the machinery of thinking, right? And so now you've got two different systems going on in the brain. Here's your two brains, if you like, or two of your brains, operating together and apart, but maybe having some difficulty to link them up. And because it's bringing in the emotional side, now you're into embodied cognition, hot cognition as opposed to cold cognition, in the sense that now you've got the whole body's physiological responses to these situations coming into play and being factored in, irrespective of what clever thoughts are going on in the brain. So it's all becoming very messy. But, I still go back to the argument, well, never mind, let's not worry too much about that. If, the philosophers haven't, been worrying about this since Plato probably. And after 2,500 years, they haven't solved the problem. So they've had a big chance. Let's just go and get some data and see what that tells us. So, and this is not to say that what philosophers don't do is useful. It's simply to say that it's a fundamentally difficult problem to solve, which is what the nature of most philosophical problems are. But we don't want to hang around and wait for philosophers to solve them, or to try and pretend to be philosophers ourselves, because we just do it even, very badly. It's best for, us in the science end just to get on and collect some data, and then both the philosophers and us can sit back and look at this stuff and see how it, sort of allows us to understand the problem better. And I kind of think, there's, the kind of fashion for what's become known as neurophilosophy among some philosophers of mind in particular, is not without its merit. There's every good reason going back to Aristotle, who was an incredibly good empiricist. You have no idea how much Aristotle got right in his biology. His physics was very bad, by and large, and some bits of his biology were not good either. He got a bit confused about the process of conception. But most of his biology, and particularly where it was organismic biology, it was incredibly good. It wasn't rediscovered by science, most of it, until the 19th century, early 20th century, and then finally shown to be right. But by then, everybody had forgotten that Aristotle had already said it. Some of the kind of general principles of evolutionary biology are already there in Aristotle's Anima, and it was because he was an absolutely acute observer. So I'm a great believer in the observation, the empirical side and the philosophical side coming together, and each doing their job separately, and then sort of feeding off each other, and the empirical information coming in to help illuminate philosophical problems.
I have a question that goes back to your paper on the cause of family and friends. And the question is, what is your view on the importance of the social network structure on the emotional closeness of the tie? So a social network structure, for example, the density or the cohesion of the network. So you have an evolutionary approach to that question, and I'm curious about your view on the more social network argument structure, no? In terms of the importance of the structure on the closeness of the tie.
It's a kind of difficult question, actually. And in a roundabout answer to that question, I'm simply going to say that I operate on a very schizophrenic basis when I do science. And so I work at many different levels at the same time. And operating on the principle of Tim Bergen's 4 whys, really. So I'll be looking at different aspects of the question that, and doing it completely independently. So I might be looking at the psychological component, but I'm looking at it as a psychologist. And then if I'm looking at the functional evolutionary side, I forget I'm a psychologist and I become a biologist, and I think as a biologist. And I find this very satisfactory. I blame philosophers for this completely, because philosophy was what I wanted to study as a student, and I went to university to do it, and then I found it was incredibly difficult, and psychology was easier, so I became a psychologist. But the one thing I learned from philosophy was to ignore other people's disciplinary boundaries and to try and put all these things together. But at the same time, I learned from biology the principle of Tim Bergen's 4 whys, that also to try and keep these separated and not to confuse them. So I'm not sure I've ever thought about your question, so it's a very interesting one, and there must be an answer. But when I've looked at network density and things, I'm not thinking like a biologist about it. I'm thinking like a social scientist, and just looking at the mechanisms component and going, oh, that's really interesting. Look, when networks are very dense, they have certain consequences for how well things work in there. But we've never sat down and thought, now I wonder why, in evolutionary terms, that should come to be. Is it just an accident, or is it actually part of the design of the system? And some people are very good at making dense networks, and other people aren't. So biologists would want to know then whether people who make dense networks not merely are more generous towards each other, but end up having more children, or at least higher genetic fitness. That's the copies of their gene are propagated in future generations, whether they reproduce or a relative reproduces more effectively. And we've never done that. It's actually quite difficult to do, is the problem, because most of the evolutionary work in these areas, the field that's known as behavioral ecology, studying humans or animals, you're looking at direct correlations as best you can between performance, capacity, behavior or whatever, and output, which is the number of offspring produced usually as a proxy for genetic fitness, a crude proxy. when you're in, and what makes this, and that's sort of fairly simple, but it's mostly doable. You can kind of measure how much effort birds put into, how well they choose their mates, how much effort they put into feeding the young, and you can measure the consequences of that because it's quite direct. But when you start to get into these complex social systems like you have in primates and some other mammals, where you've got these tiers of sociality, different grouping levels, where each grouping level is providing a different component to overall fitness for the individual, then it becomes extremely difficult to link these various levels together in fitness terms, because one level, the low levels are producing immediate returns, the high levels are producing future returns, maybe many, many years down the line. You could only measure it at the end of a lifetime. And if you've got an elephant or a human which lives for 70 years, and scientists have a working life of 10, well, let's say 30 years, then you can't do it in the lifetime. You can't actually study the whole system in the lifetime of a working scientist. So you start having to work by even more crude proxies, perhaps. So, you know, that's my excuse for not having thought about it or having done it. But you know, we should never, in science, I think we should never be discouraged by impossible tasks. That was Medoir's advice to young scientists. Don't solve problems which are easily solved. It doesn't add new knowledge. It doesn't get you the Nobel Prize. Find a really difficult problem and solve it. But the skill is in finding a difficult problem that is in principle solvable in your working life. So I guess I have to say I was lucky rather than smart. I found some interesting problems which turned out to be kind of difficult, but not so difficult to actually solve. So we got some really fun answers out of it, but it's more by luck than judgment, I think.
Bueno, en nombre de los grupos organizadores, que son el Grupo Interdisciplinario de Investigación Mente y Lenguaje, Estudios Generales Letras, la Escuela de Posgrado, quisiera agradecerles a ustedes por su participación, pero very especially I want to thank Professor Dunbar for his wonderful and excellent talk today. Gracias.
Thank you for being an excellent audience and asking lots of penetrating and difficult questions.